One contaminated ingredient and countless lives at risk. There's a surge in E. coli infections traced back to fast food, and unfortunately, it's not a rare incident. It's a dangerous pattern. How safe is our food supply? We're peeling back the layers on a system that's letting contaminated produce hit our plates. Pam Killeen is an author and health coach with a focus on educating people about improving their sleep quality. She's also the host of the Circadian Reboot with Pam Killeen podcast. Pam, welcome back. How are you?
I'm great, Richard. How are you doing?
Very well. So let's talk about this case specifically. The E. coli outbreak. I guess these were contaminated onions found in McDonald's hamburgers.
I think there were a few reports of a few different types of contamination recently. And one of the articles I sent you, Richard, actually pointed out that there's been an increase in outbreaks since last year. And it's quite meaningful because if this trend keeps continuing into, say, for example, next year, then of course there's going to be more hospitalizations, more deaths, more overall illness because of basically what I perceive to be irresponsible agricultural practices. I think really that's the crux of the problem. And unfortunately, the CFIA, which is the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, is going to say it's a lack of testing. But I think we need to take a step back and actually examine what's really causing a lot of these outbreaks. And it comes down to, I think, the factory farming being a big part of the problem. If you look at the side of these buildings where they raise hundreds, if not thousands of animals under one roof, beside that building, you're going to find manure lagoons. And that manure can be heavily contaminated, not just with infection, but heavy metals, medications that they're giving these animals, and so on. And they take this manure and they actually use that as fertilizer. And I think that's really the crux of the problem.
There was even a listeria outbreak, and they were recalling waffles. How does something like that happen? How does listeria end up in our waffles?
It could be, it still could be that some part of that waffle comes from a farm or somewhere where they were using manure to fertilize the soil. Again, they're going to say that the factory wasn't examining or sterilizing their equipment properly. They'll come up with some kind of excuse as to why this is going on. But I think that really a lot of these problems historically have come from irresponsible manure fertilization of the land. And so whatever they're putting on the land through these untreated manure sprays is somehow getting into whatever vegetation or whatever is ending up on our shelves today. And I don't need to probably remind your listeners about what happened in Walkerton. Now, that's not food poisoning. It happened in our water supply. But it is a clarion call as to what is happening today with these outbreaks. And it's quite honestly, Richard, to come on your show and to be able to talk about this is quite controversial. They don't want consumers to know about how manure is being used to fertilize our crops. And so they skirt around the issue all the time. But if we look back at Walkerton, which happened in 2000, and 2,300 people got sick and 7 people died. And there's a lot of people today that are still very, very sick from that E. coli exposure. Now, I don't know if you remember the details, Richard, of what happened back then, but
I was on the radio then. But it's a little murky. No pun intended.
No. It's a long time ago, and I wish we had learned from this. But nevertheless, what had happened was there was a heavy, heavy rainfall. And the manure lagoons from the factory farms in Walkerton, and there are a lot of factory farms in Walkerton, that the manure lagoons actually spilled over into the land, and that actually got into the wells in Walkerton. And then, of course, they blamed the guys that were working the water supply that night. They said they were basically, let's just say, asleep on the job. Mm-hmm. So they weren't consistently testing. And so, but still, there was a heavy rainfall, and that manure lagoon basically spilled over into the water supply, and people sadly, tragically got very, very sick, and even some of them died. But, these manure lagoons are very, very much a huge problem. Now, if they're going to use manure to fertilize our soils, it should be treated somehow to minimize the risk of spreading any kind of pathogen.
So what can we do realistically to protect ourselves from these kinds of outbreaks, food contamination in fast food or frozen food in the case of waffles or our produce?
Yeah, well, there's lots of things you can do. Of course, buying your food from small local farms is a big part of the solution. And when you're buying your food from a small local farm, these farmers are probably not going to be using irresponsible agricultural practices. They're they're stewards of the land. They're going to do much more sustainable practices than your big factory operations. And not only will you minimize your risk of getting food poisoning by buying from small local farms, you're going to be supporting your local economy as well. And so we need to keep our money here in Canada. We need to keep promoting small local farms. And if we don't, unfortunately, we don't want our food to come from China. Let's just face it. We don't want that to happen. So we need to keep the money focused at these wonderful stewards of our land, the local farmers, and also preparing your food from scratch is another way that you can minimize your chances of getting food poisoning. Now, you're never going to be zero chance, Richard. I mean, nobody's going to be zero chance of getting food poisoning, even when you're buying from these wonderful small family farms. But when you're cooking food from scratch, again, there's a lot of things that you can do to try to prevent any kind of food poisoning, because you don't want your meat left on your counter for hours at a time either. So you still need to use your common sense, in a sense, to make sure that you don't increase your chances by some of the cooking practices that you have. So these are small things that you can do to reduce your chances of getting sick from any kind of outbreak, whether it be Campylobacter, E. coli, Listeria, any of these types of things. And you can have a little bit more control if you take these extra steps.
Any products that you can, let's say when you're rinsing your vegetables to destroy pathogens, how do you feel like just maybe a drop or two of bleach in the water when you're like to wash the apples?
Yeah, some people just use vinegar. Some people just use vinegar to wash like their chicken before they eat it. There's all sorts of other things that you're right. Like some people use apple cider vinegar. Some people use chlorine dioxide. Some people use ozone. You can use potentially to try and reduce any chances of picking up any pathogens that way. And there's another point as well, that if you're prone to food poisoning, Richard, I know we're winding down here, but I'll just leave your listeners with one little point, is that if you're prone to picking up food poisoning, then you need to look at your stomach, because what's happening with people who, for example, if you're at a family party and one person gets food poisoning from eating the potato salad and nobody else does, then there's a good chance that person doesn't have enough stomach acid. And so oftentimes it's basically, and I'm saying this generally, is stress is going to interfere with your digestion, making you more vulnerable to getting some of these pathogens. So you have to really work on bringing your stress levels down, improving your digestion, and that's yet another way you can reduce your chances of getting food poisoning.
Very valuable, powerful information, Pam. Thank you. Pam Killeen, author, health coach, and the website, pamkilleen.com, Killeen, pamkilleen.com, the podcast, Circadian Reboot with Pam Killeen. Pam, always a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Richard.